Welcome back to the podcast where we talk about the big ideas behind fiction projects of all different kinds. Books, TV shows, movies, video games, nothing is off limits. Today we're going to talk about soccer with cars. That's right, the big idea here is playing soccer on a soccer field with cars. The video game that I'm referring to is, of course, Rocket League. Rocket League is a AAA title in an industry that made over $120 billion last year. Rocket League is one of the few truly multiplayer games offering cross-platform play with virtually every major system. In fact, probably literally every major system. It was created by Psyonix Studios and released in July of 2015. All right, so my guest today is Mark, and Mark is a avid consumer of creative fiction in many forms and a good friend of mine. How you doing, Mark?
I'm doing great. It's good to see you, man.
Good to see you too. You were mentioning a game you're playing recently. Since we're talking about games today, what's that indie game you were just telling me about?
Oh, Kentucky Route Zero. Yeah, I've read about it on some forums a few times relating to the Nintendo Switch, which is the gaming console that I have and that I've been using for the past couple of years after getting back into games for the first time since, I guess, college. Pretty cool game. Just literally started getting into it, so I don't know too much about it. But as I was mentioning, it's got this whole choose your own adventure vibe to it. Really stylized, beautiful graphics, very artsy, dark, and like really colorful, and like in all the right ways, like mixed in with like very dark elements. The contrast is really cool. I'm really excited to get into it. So we'll see how that goes.
Today we're talking about Rocket League, and Rocket League is a third-person soccer game. It's soccer with cars. Their like prototype name was Sockcar, SOC-CAR. So that's a cute little fun.
I did not know that. That's a great description. I basically, I guess Rocket League would be a mix of soccer and racing and explosions and vehicular combat, if you will, added in with a little bit of multiplayer.
That's right. Actually, that's a really good description, and it hits on some of the points when they were trying to develop this creative idea. Like, soccer with cars is actually a pretty creative concept, and it was done even more creatively than that because they let go of some of the grounding physics so that it's really a lot more acrobatic than just soccer with cars, right?
Very true. Yeah, it's like got this low G feel to it. So, you jump and landing takes a little bit longer than you'd expect it. You hit the ball, you'd kind of expect it to go a certain way, and it takes a little getting used to the physics, like you were mentioning. The ball will just kind of float a little longer than you expect it to before it finally lands. So anticipating the shots in the beginning can be a little weird. But at the same time, I think what makes the game so good, in my opinion, is that it's so accessible. It's very accessible. When you start playing, you immediately understand what's going on. This is car soccer, right? There's a red team, there's a blue team, and you have to get the ball through the goal to score. I think it's more soccer-y than even games like FIFA, where you have to push all these buttons to shoot, to pass. Here, you only hit the ball by physically running or flying into it with your rocket-powered car. So you could jump, you can boost. That's about it. Other than that, you just got to hit it physically. So it's very fast-paced, which also helps. And it's simple, and it's fun. So I think it's such a great feeling when you score your first goal, and then you're kind of hooked from there. Because the physics does get a little bit of getting used to. But once you score that first goal, you're hooked, and then you can't stop. Part of the simplicity also is there's no character abilities to memorize, no leveling up. There's no economic sub-game. Super accessible and easy to get into. But then again, once you start playing and competing, you also quickly realize that at the higher levels, you need some insane skills to be able to win. It's got a very low barrier to entry, but then the sky's the limit for the skill ceiling. It's almost impossible to master. I just would get slaughtered, but it's still fun. And the nice thing is when you play online, you usually get matched up to your skill level. So the games are usually pretty fair. Then you get a taste of these ridiculous guys once in a while who come on, and there's this one player on the other team or on your team who's just doing these insane acrobatic goals that you're just like, what on earth? So you get a taste of it and you see what's possible, and you're like, well, wow, that's scary, but also very inspiring.
Yeah, so I think you hit on a bunch of things that really made this concept work, right? I think if you said, all right, we have 10 game design teams who've never heard of Rocket League or played anything like it, and we want them to make soccer with cars, you would get 10 very different games. And only some of those games, really maybe one or two, would have the combination you mentioned of accessible and simple initially, right? Maybe a little frustrating because it does require you to, have a good mental 3D map and be able to control and move with the camera moving. That
Yeah.
3D element's tricky, but relatively simple. And like you said, when you score your first goal, which I'm looking forward to someday, it's really a hook, right? You get hooked and you're like, okay, I get it. This is fun. I can do this. The other piece you kept talking about is there's a lot of room for growth, right? It's simple, it's accessible to start, but because like in FIFA, you hit a button and the guy just executes whatever combo you hit the button for. It's not really about your skill. This game, however, you actually have to angle things and pay attention to momentum. So it's a lot more like a real ball game in that respect,
Oh
because you
yeah.
have to think about the physics of it in order to make it happen, and it requires practice.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, I definitely think that's part of what makes this idea really float, is that it's very accessible and very simple to start, but there's a lot of room to grow and practice. So I like that you mentioned that. It's totally true.
Yeah, it's very true. You'll be seeing yourself improve, making goals like this week that you could have never have made last week, and being able to save those replays and watch them is just so satisfying. And you get to customize your own car. So the game
Mhm.
came out like way back in 2015, I think. And that's also part of what makes it such a fun community. Every year there's different seasons and game styles going on, which is really cool. They have this like one thing, they had this one thing 2 weeks ago. This one mode you could play where the ball would, if you barely tapped it, and it would just absolutely just rocket across, like just a super high powered, fast powered like ball. So you would barely touch it and it would just like zoom past everybody. And it was basically the first hit. Whoever got the first hit, it would be impossible to get that ball back. It would just bounce all across the field. And it was just, and oftentimes it would just, a random goal would be scored. And there's nothing anybody can do about it because the ball is just moving so insanely fast. So like game modes like that can be fun too. So it's cool what the developers are, come up with to kind of keep it fresh.
Yeah, absolutely. So it sounds like another really key element of what makes this idea work over time is that it's adaptable, it's flexible, right? There's a lot you can play with without destroying the core game or disrupting the core idea. There's a lot of permutations that you can keep playing with and changing and adapting and just keep it fresh.
Oh, for sure. I think, like we were talking about, the mechanics are probably the hardest thing to master. The physics are strange. There's a lot of strategy once you get a handle of the physics, like rotation, like landing on your wheels like a cat. Like you're in the air half the time, and just landing on your wheels is a huge thing to master in the beginning. Very like basic first skill to learn, in my opinion. You learn that, for instance, hitting the ball with your wheels is softer than hitting it with the top of your car, right? Which will send the ball like flying much harder. With the wheels, it's like a nice softer touch. So it's cool. When you start playing, learning those mechanics, actually hitting the ball and understanding the somewhat unique physics are the first challenges. Then you get into it, and then thanks to the developers, they keep it pretty fresh. Apparently, the only history that I know about it is that apparently it was going to be some kind of car fighting game in the beginning. It was like a mix between Twisted Metal. Do you remember that game?
Yeah, of course.
PlayStation and Super Smash Brothers. So that was the developer's original intent. And then somebody added a ball in there, and it was originally going to be like a side mode, but the developers became obsessed with it. They couldn't stop playing it, and everyone actually had trouble working on the game because they just kept playing with it, trying to hit the ball. And so they realized that they were onto something there. And so what they did was smart. They released it, I think, in 2015 for PC and PS4, and it was free, which was a controversial decision at the time.
Yeah, for PS Plus subscribers, yeah.
That's right, yeah. But I think that was really smart because it probably allowed the initial batch of players to try it and quickly get hooked, and then convince all of their friends to get it and pay for it, right? Which is genius. I mean, it's like one of the biggest like esports games out there right now.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's got this kind of indie feel, but it's a AAA game for sure at this point, and a lot of it has to do with this release strategy. But I actually do want to back up a little bit and talk about the evolution of this idea and the creation, like the manifestation of it into a real thing that's so successful.
Yeah.
So backing up, Dave Hagewood is the head of Psyonix Studios, but before he had his own studio, he worked as part of a group on Unreal Tournament 2004. Do you remember the Unreal Tournament series?
Is there an Unreal Engine? Is that related
Yes.
to anything at all?
Yes. So they created an engine for I think it was originally just like an arena first person shooter. And Unreal Tournament 2004 was sort of the latest version of that. And they added a mode called Onslaught Mode. And Onslaught Mode was basically an arena shooter, but it was a big, huge open space. And in order to get across the space, they added vehicles like tanks. And in order to code those tanks in Unreal, like in the engine at the time, they hired Dave Hagewood and I think some other guys in this team. Onslaught is this kind of legendary mode that I think a lot of people really loved and maybe even preferred because it was sort of like I don't think Unreal Tournament 2004 was a big leap forward except for Onslaught. And so a lot of people ended up playing it. That kind of extended the life of the game. So that's where they got a lot of the coding experience around vehicles, got interested in vehicles. And then Dave Hagewood decided to create his own company and kind of branch off because expertise in Unreal was not something that most companies had, and it's something that they needed. So he tried to create what he called a balanced company where they did like 50% or 60% trying to keep the lights on by doing project work for other games like AAA games. So they learned how to code in Unreal and do multiplayer and vehicles and a few other things to make it like really pretty and smooth and run extremely well. But they also worked on their dream game, which was basically this concept. And I don't know if you know this, but Rocket League is a sequel. Did you know that?
I did not know that. No.
The original game was Supersonic Acrobatic rocket powered battle cars. Supersonic Acrobatic rocket powered battle cars.
Wow.
That's the first game. It was released. It's a real game, and people played it for years.
Wow. It's all in the. It's a name in the vein of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles or Nickasonic Teenage Warhead or whatever.
Yes, exactly. But like
amazing.
Worse. It's like even worse than that.
Wow. It's amazing.
Yeah, there's not even like a good acronym or anything you can do with it.
I mean, I'm not a big gamer, but I've definitely never heard of that game, so I'm guessing it might have not done too well.
Yes, so they learned a couple things which you alluded to earlier, which I think is really interesting because it certainly highlights that they learned their lessons. Like, for example, they released this game and it had a terrible name, right? So it was hard for people to talk about it and it was confusing and weird. And maybe people thought it was like a translation of like a Japanese name or something like that. So it was like very unappealing, right? But there were people who played it. It's basically the same game. It didn't have the polish of this game because they didn't use a lot of the people on Supersonic. I'm just going to call it Supersonic. They didn't use a lot of their people who were like really good with polishing AAA games for multiplayer and graphics and all that kind of stuff. They didn't use them because he was trying to keep his company balanced and kind of do this like almost like a side project, this like dream game. Since they didn't bring their talented, like top in the field guys onto this game, it doesn't look as good. The multiplayer doesn't work as well. It's not as smooth. It looks like an indie game, right? It doesn't look like Rocket League. It looks like something that some professionals could do, but not under a lot of pressure. And the other thing is it built up a core following really quickly. So there were some people who really liked it and played it a lot, but because the game takes practice and skill and they didn't have a lot of players, there was no ability matching, which is something you highlighted immediately, right? And I know you can see how big of a problem that is, right?
Oh, yeah, huge.
Right. I mean, so like, what do? You get this game. It's probably not really expensive. You go through the whole loading process. You start playing and you get destroyed in every single match because you have no idea what's going on. Right. So what do? You just, who cares? It wasn't that much money. I don't really care. They had some people playing it and they got to know those people pretty well because they were really into it and it's a super fun game. But unfortunately, nobody else could really penetrate that and it could never catch on.
Yeah, everybody else would just rage quit. Yeah, who wants to play where you're getting decimated
I thought I was the
nonstop?
only one. Yeah. So
Yeah.
anyway, they continued doing project work, and then they stuck with the idea of soccer with cars, and they decided that they would do it again. But this time, Dave Higwood pulled some of their best people over to work on this game. They hired a marketing manager and got a much better name, and ended up with Rocket League. Yeah, and then they immediately did like a lot of publicity for it. They gave it away free on the PlayStation. Like they really tried to kind of build the community quick and early, and it obviously paid off.
Oh yeah, great move. Yeah, they really seemed to know what they were doing the second time around. The game itself is very polished. The marketing strategy they were so on top of it. That was very polished. It was just so well done. The entire thing was just a solid effort. The big question for me is there going to be a Rocket League 2 coming out soon?
Ooh. What would you do in Rocket League 2? Let's talk about that.
I wonder, what would they do? Would they just make the graphics look better? Would they just change the cars around, change the stadiums? But I mean, they keep adding new stadiums to play it. So I don't really even know. I don't know what they would do. That's a great question. I don't know what they would do for a Rocket League 2. That would be substantially different.
Yeah, well, you mentioned a couple things I wanted to talk about too. And this podcast is really supposed to be, ideally, I mean, at some point or another, about creativity and where those ideas come from, right? How they're developed, why they work sometimes, why they don't work other times. And what I think is really interesting is they had this philosophy as they were creating the game, which again, you alluded to, because I think it's that important and it's kind of obvious to players on some intuitive level. But the philosophy was design as you go. So they started with, like you said, like a vehicular combat game. They had all these different permutations. At one point, there was like a grappling hook thing where you could do like an obstacle course and stuff like that. But like you said, someone had the idea of adding a ball, and it was just going to be one mode, but it pretty much shut down work at the studio for 2 weeks because everybody was just playing that one mode. They said, great, that's the game. We're going with that, right? Same thing at one point where somebody added in like the boost feature, and it was basically flying, and it was sort of like the physics were kind of off, and they could label that a bug and they could have fixed it, but it was fun. So they just went with it, right? So that kind of design as you go, or as the head of the studio put it, chase the fun, is I think really, really central to making this idea work. Soccer with cars is kind of creative, sort of like playing regular soccer with a giant ball. Like it's kind of fun, right? It's a good idea for a bit, but if you keep chasing the fun, just playing with things, introducing things, and whatever people are responding to, you do more of that. That's how you get Rocket League. What do you think?
Oh yeah, it's genius. I don't know how typical that sort of strategy is for game studios, but it obviously paid off with them. I could imagine most teams would sit down when you have an idea for a game, you would sit down together and have sort of a strategy. Okay, and this is how we're going to approach it. We're going to build toward, we have the goal and we're going to go ahead and work towards that. I don't know how much you would deviate from that really, which obviously Rocket League just threw that whole concept on its head, and it worked beautifully.
As I've said, it's not the only thing, but it is a really important thing, right? So chasing the fun. So if you think about like the latest Call of Duty, and I'm sure there's one due out next week or last week or something like that, right? They have the concept. It's down. They assign it to a studio. The studio cranks it out. They probably start outlining maps and drawing artwork for the production of it and all sorts of things really early. Probably a certain percentage of it is just done because it's ported over from a previous version. And you have an expectation of what you're creating before you really get started. And that might seem more efficient, but it doesn't produce really interesting, exciting things that stand out. It produces more of the same, And like I said, that's not enough to make an idea float and to make it last. There's connecting to the community and thinking about marketing and a variety of other things, right? You've really got to connect with the players, but chasing the fun is something, it's almost like a luxury that we often don't allow in creative processes.
That is so true. Yeah, it was a gamble that definitely paid off on their part.
Mhm.
I wonder who thought of adding a ball in there.
Yeah.
I mean, what a genius concept that ended up being. It could have been a very different game. It would have been an entirely different game otherwise.
Yeah, totally. And probably forgettable, you know?
Probably, although Twisted Metal was a lot of fun.
Yeah. So let's talk about that a little bit. So I was trying to think back to the lineage of this idea, right? So not necessarily a lot of what we've talked about, but just the starting point where you're like, hey, we have a studio, we're going to make our dream game. We're pretty good with vehicles, right? Where are we drawing from? Right. And where I go first, obviously there's tons of stuff before this, but if you remember Super Mario Kart Battle Mode from 1992,
That's
right?
right.
Hugely popular. It's a pushing each other off platforms, racing around. There's random kind of goofy cartoonish shit going on. Like to me, like that's a pretty reasonable point to kind of backtrack. What do you think?
Yeah, you know what? I actually don't remember that one. I remember Battle Mode from N64 and from the current Mario Kart on the Switch.
Yeah,
They
they
have
carried it forward. Yeah.
they carried it forward. So, but I'm familiar with the concept. And yeah, you're definitely right. I could definitely see that as an inspiration for the creators at first. Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah. And then Twisted Metal 1995, which was obviously much more grounded, much more like, I'm going to say realistic, at least in the physics, if not some of the explosions and the stuff going on. Correct me if I'm wrong. Doesn't Rocket League have one of the Twisted Metal, like the clown ice cream truck or something, as an option? Isn't that a vehicle that you can drive around? Don't they have some Twisted Metal references?
I don't know that I've seen that truck, but I mean, there's a van that looks a lot like it, but without the clown.
Okay.
But you can get toppers, right? As I was
Mhm.
mentioning earlier, you can customize your vehicle. So I'm pretty sure there's got to be a topper out there with like some crazy clown thing that you could put on top of your van, and it would look just like it. I'm sure. Twisted Metal 2 was my intro to Twisted Metal. That was so awesome. I spent so many hours on that game
Yeah.
at my buddy's house who had PS2. That was awesome.
Yeah, Twisted Metal 1 was on the PS1, I believe. Twisted Metal 2 was, I don't know numbers wise, but that is the game I know of
That's
all
the
the
game I
Twisted.
know. Yep.
Absolutely. I think that's the game most people probably were introduced to who were around and playing video games at that time.
Boards were just so awesome.
Yeah.
So detailed, the underpasses, the different areas you could go to. And I realized how much that game had an impact on me when I first fired up Rocket League and the first car that I created, because I would always play as Warthog and
Mm.
Twisted Metal. The big guy, big and slow. He's kind of like a more of a hulking like tank.
Mhm.
I wasn't good enough with the speed when I first started that game, so I could handle a guy who could take a lot of hits and go slower. And like I would have more time to strategize, and that worked really well for me at the time. And so I remember with Rocket League creating my first customization was this one of the bigger cars and more hulking. And then as I got better at the game, I went for the sleeker, slightly smaller cars, which was cool.
Yeah, that is often the way it goes, right? You get more skillful, so you want something more maneuverable, more nimble. You're not taking as many hits, so you don't need something that's as armored. Yeah.
Yeah. Although it's interesting, I have no idea what the truth is on this. I don't know whether supposedly in Rocket League, all the vehicles have the same speed, the same acceleration, apparently. They can jump higher, or they jump the same height, rather. It's not like the bigger cars are slower, can jump like not as high. The only difference, supposedly, is the hitbox. So the shape of the car is the
Oh,
only thing supposedly that matters. Although people swear as they play, they're like, when you're playing with one car the whole time for a while, and you switch to like either a smaller, sleeker car or a bigger, bulkier car, people swear that the feel is different. I don't know if there's like what the science is behind that, what the code actually is like, and if that's actually true, but it does feel different, but it's not supposed to be any different. So that's interesting too, though.
Yeah.
Because I guess the advantage of that is it does keep the playing field level. So it's not
Mhm.
like certain cars are most definitely better than others, supposedly. Maybe it's just only related to the hitbox, which is the shape of the car. But who knows? That's a question for the developers, I guess.
It's a really great question, and it segues nicely into one of the things I wanted to talk about too. You mentioned a cross-platform play. And for my money, there are really only two games that are, I'm going to say AAA games or top tier games financially, success wise. It's a huge business. These are games that make money, that work, that run smoothly, that look nice. There are only really two of them that are truly cross-play. And that's going to be Rocket League. And any guess what the other one is?
Fortnite?
Got it. Yeah, Fortnite's the other one. And they have something in common, which is no matter how much you play, you really can't win an advantage that you get to keep in the next round. In other words, other than your own skill, it's a level playing field.
Yeah. Yeah, I could see that. That's true. I would have to agree.
Yeah. And they're also both not graphics as heavy as they could be, which is another thing. We talked about what would you do with the sequel. If you increase the graphics, I'm not sure how that affects crossplay, right?
Yeah.
You can probably tweak them a little bit, but if you go too much, then you suddenly can't as smoothly or as easily translate between systems and interfaces and things like that. But also the controls are simple enough in both games that you can translate it between different types of controllers, keyboards, things like that. And it doesn't disrupt the game. It doesn't give anybody a massive advantage. I think with Fortnite, it's more of a problem.
I just really don't see there being any difference. I think I personally feel like, I mean, you're driving a car, so it might be easier to have a joystick in your hands. The controls are just so much easier. And the only buttons you need is jump and like boost, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's it. The rest is just steering. So very simple and just checking people, making them explode. That. So you just do it.
Yeah, I love that. They specifically mentioned that they added extra explosions and things. It seems like someone who's played as much as you have recognizes that there are probably a handful of basic skills that you can learn. But one of the things I like about the game is if you land upside down, it just flips you over, right? Isn't that what it does?
I think so. It either flips you over automatically after a second or two, or you just hit the jump button like once or twice and you just kind of flip back. So it's very simple, yeah. But learning to land on your wheels so that you could just keep going could make all the difference,
Absolutely. And I think a developer who took the game really seriously in a less fun way would have you explode or have you sit on your back for a long time, like add, 1,000, 1,000 longer, something like that. But they really struck that balance of keeping it fun and not being too frustrating, which I think is really, really important, not just with games, but if you're writing a novel, if you're doing a TV series, you want to be aware of where your audience's frustration level is, their confusion level, their annoyance, right? And you can play with that a little bit, but you can't push it too far because this is entertainment, right? It's not meant to be something that you invest in long term and pour your sweat into, and then you get a bunch of nothing back, flashing lights.
Very true. Very true. So the strange physics, as strange as they are in the beginning, they're not too big of a barrier. Like you can quickly learn to adjust. So they do take into account, and they keep that element of fun in there. They make sure that learning curve is not too steep, and that the physics and everything isn't too weird at the end of the day, which is smart.
Yeah. So what was your introduction to this game?
I had heard some friends talking about it, but it wasn't until I got the Switch and I was looking for games to play, and it was either free or very cheap. So it was like one of the first games I collected on there. And then as soon as I started, I mean, I got hooked because it was just so fun. My personal conclusion of that game after playing it a little while is it's just fun as hell. That's what gets you hooked.
Yeah. Absolutely. And the multiplayer part is really key, being able to play with other humans because they could have made this game just 100% AI. You just play against
Yeah.
robots.
And that's how I got better at first was I realized like I didn't know what I was doing. So playing with the humans wasn't even as fun because they were just everybody was kind of better than me and I had trouble even touching the ball. And so what I did is you can play just on you can play locally on your own console. You can do a season. And so you just make your own team. It's 3 versus 3 and it's all AI. And then I got good just practicing there. And that was a lot of fun actually at first. And then I felt like I got better and then I started playing with the humans online.
That's great. I wonder too with the design if it's less of a cash cow than it could be. Just thinking about some of the other developments some of these games make, where they really charge people for so many different things. This game seems to add them relatively for free. I mean, I know they have some things for purchase, but it's so cosmetic and they seem to just have a real joy to play the game. So they throw out new arenas and new things like that just to keep it fresh and they don't keep charging users. I mean, that's a really cool model. I don't know if it's economically as successful, but they've certainly built a great reputation with the community.
Yeah, you're right. Because the game itself is very cheap, and the only things I've ever paid for is a couple cosmetic things. After I was playing the game for a while, and I was like, "Oh, that actually is really cool. I would love that." Whatever. I'll go ahead and pay $5 for that. And I've done that a couple of times. But you're right. Other than that, everything is free. You could trade with people, so the trading system is like really active and you can you trade for all your car customizations and explosions and whatnot. But for some reason on the Switch, it's not available.
Oh,
As far,
interesting.
yeah, because I really want that tactical nuke explosion so bad, and it's just not available on Switch, and I am very disappointed.
Well, that's what you get for buying a Switch, I guess.
Right.
I guess that's motivation to have more cross-platform play.
Yeah, and I don't know if having it as an esport, I'm sure they got a cut of that, right?
I would think, yeah, and then I'm sure it's good for them. But as far as I know, they haven't been cranking out other titles. Like they haven't been trading on this great reputation, doing other things, kind of building on it. And maybe they're silently working on something. Maybe they're a company who continues not to focus on deadlines and putting themselves in a position where they need to crank out a game every September or whatever, the latest version and that kind of stuff. Maybe they're working on their next dream game, or maybe it's Rocket League 2, who knows? But they definitely don't seem to be parlaying this success systematically into building an empire.
Yeah, I almost wonder back to our initial one of our first topics. I wonder if they're working on a new engine because maybe it's not worth coming out with a new game until they have a brand new, more refined engine. Even so coming out and seeing as they were so good at coming up with the first Unreal Engine, they're probably working on Unreal 2 or something before they even consider a Rocket League 2. I wonder.
Yeah. What is it? Unreal is on 5. Their engine's on the 5th iteration, maybe, or I'm sure it's the 5,000th, but it's Unreal 5, maybe. I don't know. But yeah,
Okay.
Unreal underlies a lot of games. I think it underlies or is like sort of the foundation for Doom, maybe the new Doom stuff as well. And some, yeah, what was it? There's a couple other games. I mean, a lot of other games. So I'm not really sure how that fits in with
What do I
Rocket.
know? I honestly had no idea. I didn't even know there were various generations of Unreal already out there. So that makes sense.
Well, on the business side, it's interesting to take a look at how a lot of these game developers are evolving. Like some of them, what is it, Epic Games make Unreal, right? That's become a big part of their business. It's probably not really cranking out games as much as cranking out the basis for games. And Valve, as you mentioned, switched over to Steam and they've done kind of jack and shit, really. I mean, there's a VR Half-Life game that came out recently, but they were making Left 4 Dead, Half-Life series, a bunch of other stuff. Really good games, some still classic games, but they started making so much money off of their marketplace, Steam, that they just kind of went full tilt into just collecting money and I guess programming this interface to make sure that it processes your credit card quickly enough. And that's kind of it, which is really interesting.
That is interesting. Well, that was their model changed. They were making money that way, and that was good enough for them, I guess. And I'm sure those developers who wanted to make cool games probably moved on to other companies. It's just the nature of the beast.
Yeah, Blizzard fell apart. They made StarCraft and Warcraft and World of Warcraft and all that stuff. And they keep making stuff, but man, when Blizzard North broke off, it's almost like a lot of these companies that 15, 20 years ago were this like rich, fertile ground for creative ideas are now just like a graveyard. It's like a dust bowl for creativity.
Wow.
Yeah. And I guess those creative people are still out there somewhere. Maybe they're working independently on indie games and crafting Kentucky Fried side scroller or whatever it was called.
Kentucky Route Zero.
There it is. Yeah, but it's been an interesting change. I mean, I wouldn't really call a lot of what's in Fortnite as creative. It's just more sort of iterations on a central creative idea or a collection of creative ideas. And I wonder if any evolution of Rocket League could really be as creative as soccer with cars, with sort of fun, creative physics and sort of a chaotic kind of 3D feel to it, or if it would just be like simply iterations on that. I don't know.
Yeah, I wonder. Yeah, beyond, because it's not just soccer. Rocket League, you can choose your mode. You can play basketball or hockey. Like there's a battle mode as well.
There is?
There is. Completely different, where you can just use different weapons. I've only played it a couple of times, and that was a couple of years ago. So I wonder what else they could do at this point. You're right. It'd be really interesting. I'm interested to see what the next phase of what Rocket League 2 would look like. I wonder.
Yeah, I wonder too, would you just go with completely different kinds of vehicles? Would you do like air or sea vehicles? Would you have like a waterboard with jet skis or something like that? Like would you do helicopters or spaceships, right? So the physics are totally different. The game is totally different because there's no gravity. I would love to see them do that. I would love to see them just go in a completely new direction. Maybe it sort of has a couple core ideas, like you're trying to score goals, but to just, play, like to just follow the fun. I think that's the key with this kind of stuff.
And I guess nobody knows better than their team, and they're pretty good at it. So I wonder where following the fun will lead them.
All right. Anything else that you want to squeeze out of Rocket League before we wrap it up for today?
I don't know. I've been inspired to probably go play a game after this. We're going to do a round. You should join me.
We totally should. Okay, that's what we're going to go do. But before we do that, I just want to let everybody know that I'm always looking for new ideas, just any kind of creative idea, preferably in a fictional project, which includes video games. I hope you guys continue to enjoy all the creative ideas out there, and I'll see you in the next episode. Thanks, Mark.
Real, man.